Today, November 29, 2018, we are in Buenos Aires to talk about with Alison Liebling. My name is Zysman Quiros. I'm from the University of Buenos Aires, Argentina. In 2001, Alison Liebling, jointly with David Price and Guy Scheffer, published an influential research and book, The Prison Officer, then updated in 2011. These interviews focused in the story and the central concepts of that book. Alison Liebling is Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Cambridge and Director of the Institute of Criminology's Prison Research Centre. Her main interests lie in changing shape and effects of improvement, the role of values in criminal justice, and the role of safety, trust, and fairness in shaping the prison experience. Alison has published several books, including Suicides in Prison, Prisons and Their Moral Performance, Prison Life, and with Chad Maruna, The Effect of Imprisonment, among others. Alison has conducted a wide range of empirical research in prisons, including studies of young offenders through care, an evaluation of 2 small units of difficult prisoners in Scotland, an evaluation of World's Private Remand Centre, an evaluation of incentives and earned privileges, an ethnographic study of staff-prisoner relationships, a study of the decision-making process of discretionary life sentence, and an evaluation of the close supervision centres for difficult prisoners, and several studies on measuring the quality of prison life. Question: When did you decide to write the book together, and when did you start it, and how was the process?
Okay, well, it started with a research project at Whitemore Prison, which has always been my favourite research project because it was barely funded. It was a kind of focused curiosity project. So the incentives and earned privileges research that you mentioned left us with a question, because we'd been evaluating the way in which prison officers introduced a new policy restricting privileges based on their judgment of prisoners' behaviour. And we observed in the high security prison in our sample that officers used the new very restricted level of privileges very differently on different wings. And the wing where they overused the basic level of restriction to privileges went on to have a major disturbance just after we'd been studying it. And it was really clear that officers were using a new coercive form of power without going through relationships with the prisoners. And so they sort of went straight for coercion, whereas on the other wings, officers were still trying to cajole and persuade prisoners into compliance, and they didn't resort to their formal power as quickly. And we watched this process, and prisoners were much more willing to accept sort of power flowing through relationships, what we eventually called quiet power. So we became really interested in why the wings were different. Why did staff use this sort of power on one wing and a different sort of power on another wing? And it obviously had different effects on prison life. So we discussed these results with the director of the high security prison estate at the time, and we just somehow decided that we should spend some time studying the work of prison officers. And there was a high security prison near to Cambridge with a new governor who wanted some kind of research relationship. And so the reason it was my favourite study was because we were just allowed full access. David Price, my co-author, worked with me. He was a PhD student at the time, and we took him off that for 6 months so that he could help out with the fieldwork. And we were just encouraged to explore the work of prison officers with no particular research question, except this curiosity about how they were using their power and discretion. And so that project, we wrote that up as a report. It was very widely discussed, and it was really well received because we used this method called appreciative inquiry. So we tried to find the best prison officers in the establishment at the time. We asked prisoners to identify who they thought the best officers were, and we shadowed them which was amazing. It was really, really interesting because in a way they articulated so little of what they did. So when we interviewed staff, they would give a kind of very simplified version of how they were working. And then when we shadowed them on their shifts, we realised they were making exceptions, they were using their discretion, they were doing quite sophisticated things that were sort of beyond the level of their own consciousness. And so the prison service responded really well to that report. And they asked for the book. They said they wanted a source where that and a few other things that we'd done could be pulled together in one place.
And even the second edition was required by prison officers.
Yes, and it's ended up being a popular book, and a lot of prison officers read it. So I still receive emails now and again from prison officers who say, "I found your book, and this is fantastic, and I didn't realise that people understood what we do." And so it's very grounded in, it's a sort of authentic description of their experience. But what's unusual about it is that most people who are interested in prisons and prison officers are interested in the abuse or overuse of power. And this, by just following staff around and naturally observing what they did, looks at the underuse of power. So how they don't use their power in order to achieve good order on a wing. And that's unusual, I think. It was unusual at the time in prison studies.
What characteristics of prison officers do you think are present in almost all prisons, and which ones distinguish British prisons?
Yeah. I haven't been everywhere, and the more I go to prisons in other jurisdictions, the more I think prison officers are like prison officers almost everywhere. There are obviously some differences, and I think these differences are largely on a continuum. So it is about how they carry their power, how they think about it, and how much of it they want to sort of carry around with them. There's obviously some structural differences. So I think if a prison system is still in a military shape, then that's a slightly different setup with very serious implications. But I think from what I've seen everywhere else, so I've been in prisons in Australia and New Zealand, some other jurisdictions, and in Scandinavian countries. In Australia and New Zealand, there's very little difference, I think, between prison officers there and British prison officers. Quite a lot of British prison officers go to Australia and New Zealand, and it's a very familiar culture. I think in Scandinavian countries there's much more professionalism and emphasis on relationships, much less heavy uses of power. And probably here, I've only been to 2 prisons, but also in Chile. It's a bit different. I think you feel the authority more overtly here, and obviously in Argentina there's still a kind of military structure to the prison service organisation. But still, if I go to therapeutic communities or special wings, it's very relationship oriented. And so I still recognise the basic structure of staff trying to do their job without heavy uses of power.
The concept of discretion and legitimacy in prison occupies an important place in the book. What differences do you find between those concepts in policing, prosecution, and in correction?
Yeah.
As you know,
yes.
as you imagine,
Yes.
can imagine, of course.
Yes. I mean, on the one hand, I was amazed to find that the policing literature is really relevant to prison work, and yet these 2 disciplines are almost in separate worlds. And so, first of all, we devoured the policing literature, and it's full of discretion and peacekeeping and using discretion for and against legitimacy, so the dangers of it, but also the best professional policing is found somewhere in the gap between following the rules and trying to maintain order. So we pulled all that literature in, and we were a bit surprised that the prisons and policing fields don't have more to say to each other. So other scholars have done that, mainly American scholars have applied interesting work that's in the policing field. So William Muir's work, for example, and it's very relevant to prison officer work. But the big difference is the enduring nature of the relationships. So I think in policing and in prosecution, it's a one-off interaction. And so how power is used in that decision-making arena is one thing. in a prison, it's the difference is that you keep coming back to the same person.
Yeah.
You have to live with the consequences of your decision making, your style, and relationships are very enduring. Sometimes prison officers know prisoners who've come back to prison. They've known their families. These are they're in a way more complex, but also more have a challenge. And I think that there's a way in which that can almost hold a prison officer to account.
If prison officers are the human face of the prison service, as you mentioned,
Yeah.
is it possible that managerialism could impact in relationships inside prisons?
Yes, this is a really important question because, and my colleague and I, Ben Crew, have recently written about the history of managerialism and its impact on the kind of tone and quality of prison life. And I think in our context, certainly in England and Wales, managerialism in its earliest form was fused with a sort of moralising agenda, the decency agenda as it was called, and a real attempt to try and improve quality and practice. And so managerialism was almost used to force a bit of transparency, accountability, structure, knowledge to the organisation. And so we called that managerialism plus, and we almost defended it at the time because of what it was a response to. So pre-managerialism, there was a lack of accountability, lots of abuses, no information, no one knew what the money was spent on. So managerialism had a role to play in a reform agenda until we had a financial crisis. Yes, I mean that can't be the only reason. Lots of things seem to have changed, and we now describe the world we're in as managerialism minus. And now it looks like the new penology, as described by Feely and Simon, where all of those risks of aggregate thinking, risk orientation, the individual is completely lost. Even the notion of rehabilitation is discussed, but it's a very narrow.
And nowadays, even big data issues.
Big data.
Big data, sorry.
Yeah.
Big data.
Big data and not much room for the moral agency of the individual, or as Feely and Simon said, that the new penology struggles with the concept of humanity. And I think that's what we're seeing happen now, that money's been stripped out, staff have been reduced, they're pretty unhappy in their organisation, and the way the organisation thinks has actually become, I don't know how to describe it, it's almost sort of, there's a language appearing of specification and benchmarking, of its componentiality. The whole is not being observed. Everything's being kind of divided up and reduced in cost. And that's been very detrimental to relationships.
Finally, which ones of your original hypotheses in 2001 could you firmly rescue today? And have you changed your mind drastically in certain subjects after the research?
Yes. I've obviously done a lot more research since, and a lot of it has involved prison officers. And in a way, I'm more and more convinced of what I originally wrote about in The Prison Officer has almost become the foundation of everything else that I've done. And the more I do it, it is about the search for the good use of authority, if good is the right word, the legitimate use of authority. And I think we have to look for it, and when we find it, describe it. And for me, that's a more interesting thing to do than to say all prisons are illegitimate, because we have them and they differ, and I think we can learn a lot from these differences between the better ones and the worse ones. And I think I'm getting more and more interested in what this good authority looks like, and also its impact, because right from the very beginning, I think I could see that these different uses of power had a serious impact on prisoners' emotional state. I've gone back to suicides in prison with all of this understanding, and now I understand the relationship between bad uses of authority and distress and suicide. So the legitimacy theorists are interested in compliance and order. I've become interested in some of that, but also well-being and survival. And also its opposite, human flourishing. And I think there's a relationship between the way in which authority is used or abused, and all sorts of different important human outcomes. And I'm still pursuing that line of work, really.
Okay, Alison, thank you very much.
Thank you.